For as long as I can remember, I've always known that my parents loved my older sister Vicky more than me. Vicky was the planned child, while I was the result of an unexpected pregnancy just 10 months later. I don't think they ever wanted me, but instead of making a different decision, they kept me, though it often felt like they regretted that choice. Growing up, it was painfully obvious who the favorite was, and that was Vicky. She got the attention, the praise, and the affection. Me? I was an afterthought, just there in the background. My mother's parents passed away before I was born, but my father's parents, my grandma and grandpa, were always in my life. They became my refuge from the cold indifference I felt at home. They provided me with the love and support I never received from my own parents. When I was young, my parents would often leave me behind with my grandparents and take Vicky on trips. At the time, I didn't mind too much because I loved being with grandma and grandpa. They were kind and fun, and they made me feel wanted. But when I started getting older, around 6 or 7 years old, I began to see how unfair it was. Vicky always got special treatment. She got everything she wanted while I was just there. And the problem wasn't just with my parents, it was with Vicky too. Even though I didn't hate Vicky, I couldn't help but feel like an outsider in my own family. Vicky knew she was the favorite, and she wielded that power over me. She made me feel small every day, always competing with me for grades, attention, or any little achievement. It felt like I was constantly in a battle, always trying to prove myself, but no matter what I did, I could never win. My parents always sided with Vicky, always excused her behavior, and always made me feel inferior. One instance stands out clearly. Vicky was trying to be friends with this group of girls, but they didn't seem interested in her. One of the girls was in my art class and she introduced me to the group. We all started hanging out, and it was the first time I had friends that weren't connected to Vicky. But Vicky couldn't stand it. She complained to my parents that I was leaving her out, and of course, they told me I had to include her. They acted like it was my job to make sure she was happy, even at my expense. I didn't want to bring her into my group, but I did as I was told. Vicky, being her usual self, came on way too strong, always trying to impress the girls, but instead, she ended up pushing them away. It was awkward. She even went so far as to tell a boy that one of the girls liked him, totally unprompted, which embarrassed her friend. The girls made it clear to me that they didn't want Vicky around anymore, and honestly, I couldn't blame them. When I told Vicky that she couldn't hang out with us anymore, she threw a fit. She ran to our parents, insisting that if the girls didn't want her, I should stop hanging out with them too. She said I wasn't being a good sister by sticking by her side, but for the first time, I stood my ground. I told her that her behavior was the reason the girls didn't want her around, and I wasn't going to cut off my friends just because she couldn't fit in. My parents were furious with me. They gave me the silent treatment for weeks, but I didn't budge. That group of friends was the first real support system I had outside of my grandparents, and I wasn't going to let Vicky or my parents take that away from me. Those girls have been my best friends ever since, like sisters to me. As we grew up, things didn't get any better between me and Vicky. There was another incident when Vicky had a crush on a boy. I didn't know about it at the time, but he and I were friends, and we sat together in some classes. He asked me to the junior prom, but I declined because I was already going with someone else. When Vicky found out, she flipped. She accused me of stealing the guy from her, even though I had no idea she liked him. She called me horrible names, things no sister should say to another, and told my parents I was purposely trying to hurt her. My parents, predictably, sided with her. My mom said I broke girl code and should have stepped aside for Vicky. I tried explaining that I wasn't even interested in the guy, and he was still free to ask her if he wanted to. But the truth is, I think Vicky knew he wasn't interested in her, and she was just angry because I was the one he asked. After that, Vicky's resentment toward me grew even more intense. She started telling lies about me, saying I was doing drugs or drinking alcohol with my boyfriend. Complete fabrications. One day, my dad took me out for ice cream, which was rare, so I was excited. But instead of having a fun father-daughter day, he started asking me weird questions. If my boyfriend and I were being careful, if he came from a good family, if we were doing drugs. I was confused until he told me that Vicky had been feeding them all these lies for months. I was furious. I showed my dad my phone, proving that none of what Vicky said was true. He confronted her, and instead of apologizing, she doubled down, saying it was obvious that no one our age just hung out without doing something bad. She punched me in the face when I called her out for making drama. I hadn't seen that coming. I ended up in the emergency room with a bleeding nose, while my parents begged me not to tell the nurse the truth about what happened. They were afraid it would ruin Vicky's life, but I did tell the truth. The nurse called Child Protective Services, CPS, and my parents were furious. They acted like I was the one who had done something wrong by getting authorities involved, like I was trying to destroy our family. They dismissed what Vicky had done as an accident, something I shouldn't have blown out of proportion. My mom cried, my dad lectured me, and I felt like the villain in my own story. CPS didn't take any further action, but they warned my parents to keep an eye on Vicky. After that, Vicky stopped talking to me altogether. It was honestly a relief. I didn't want her in my life anymore, and she felt the same way. My grandparents found out what happened and told me to pack my things so I could move in with them for the rest of high school. My parents didn't protest much. It seemed like they were relieved to be rid of me. Living with my grandparents was like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. I felt safe for the first time in years. My last couple of years in high school went smoothly, and I made great memories with my friends. My parents never visited or called, and though that hurt, I was used to it. They had Vicky, and that was all that mattered to them. By the time I graduated, my parents showed up, but not for me. They came to cheer for Vicky, who had won some academic awards. They didn't even acknowledge my existence, even though I was graduating too. It was my grandparents who supported me, who cheered for me and made me feel like I mattered. After the ceremony, my grandpa had a heated conversation with my dad, and though I didn't know what was said, my dad awkwardly came up to congratulate me. It felt forced, but I appreciated my grandpa's effort to stand up for me. A few months later, I found out I had been accepted to a great college with a full scholarship. It was the best news I could have asked for because I was dreading the thought of having to ask my parents for financial help. I told my grandparents, and they were so proud of me. Grandma even posted about it on Facebook, sharing how proud she was of me. When the relatives chimed in to congratulate me, that's when my mom called, furious. Apparently, Vicky hadn't been accepted anywhere yet, and she'd locked herself in her room crying. My mom blamed me, saying I had embarrassed Vicky by telling everyone about my scholarship. According to her, Vicky's bad grades were all my fault, stemming from the CPS incident. That phone call was the last time I spoke to my parents for a long time. I couldn't believe my own mother would accuse me of sabotaging my sister's future. It hurt, but I pushed forward. I moved into my college dorm with the help of my grandparents, ready to start a new chapter in my life, away from the toxicity of my family. When I moved to college, I finally felt free, like I could breathe again without the constant weight of my family hanging over me. The years spent living with my grandparents had been a relief, but starting fresh at college, far from the suffocating environment I'd grown up in, was a whole new level of freedom. I was determined to focus on myself and my future, leaving all the family drama behind. And for a while, I managed to do just that. At college, I met Rob. He was in my freshman year English class, and we were both regulars at the library, always spending hours studying at the same table. Rob was quiet and introverted like me, and we bonded over our shared love of books and learning. He wasn't the loud, extroverted type that drew all the attention, but there was something steady and reassuring about him that I admired. As we spent more time together, our connection deepened. I found myself looking forward to our study sessions, not just for the schoolwork, but for the conversations that came with them. Rob had this way of making me feel seen, like my thoughts and opinions mattered. It was a feeling I wasn't used to, growing up in a household where my existence seemed like an afterthought. He listened to me, really listened. And it was then I knew that my feelings for him were more than just friendship. One day, I decided to take a risk and tell him how I felt. We were sitting in the library, the smell of old books filling the air, and I turned to him and said, "Rob, I like you, like really like you, and I think we should be more than friends." His face broke into the biggest smile, and he admitted that he'd been feeling the same way, but wasn't sure if I did too. We started dating after that, and it felt like the start of something right, something real. The years passed quickly, and Rob and I became inseparable. Our relationship wasn't the dramatic kind. No big fights, no constant breakups and makeups like some of my friends went through. It was steady, like the rhythm of the ocean waves. We balanced each other out perfectly, and I think that's what made us so strong. My grandparents adored Rob, and I got along with his parents so well that they treated me like their own daughter. His mother even once told me she'd always wanted a daughter and was so happy that Rob had found someone like me. It was the first time I felt truly embraced by a family, one that wasn't mine by blood, but by love and choice. Over the years, I had little contact with my parents. They'd send the occasional birthday text if they remembered, but that was the extent of our communication. I didn't miss them, and I certainly didn't make any effort to reconnect. I had Rob, my grandparents, and a life that felt full without their presence. It felt like I had finally found my place in the world, surrounded by people who valued me for who I was, not who I was supposed to be. Then, about a year ago, Rob proposed. He knew I wasn't one for big, showy gestures, so he kept it simple but meaningful. We were hiking to one of our favorite spots to watch the sunrise. It was a place we'd been going to since our freshman year, tucked away from the noise of the city, where we could just sit and enjoy the beauty of nature. As the sun began to rise, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange, Rob pulled out a small box from his jacket and asked me to marry him. I didn't even hesitate. Of course, I said yes. It was the easiest decision I'd ever made. We took some pictures to capture the moment, and I posted a few on Instagram to share the news with friends. My grandparents were the first people I called. They were ecstatic and couldn't wait to start planning for the wedding. It felt like everything in my life was falling into place, and for once, I didn't have any worries. But then, out of nowhere, my parents called. It had been so long since we'd spoken that I was genuinely surprised they even had my number. My dad congratulated me awkwardly, and we exchanged small talk about my job and apartment. Then, he dropped the bombshell. "So, I assume I'll be walking you down the aisle, right?" he asked, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. I didn't know how to respond. For starters, it had been years since we'd even had a meaningful conversation. He didn't know anything about my life, my career, or even the basics, like what company I worked for. And now, all of a sudden, he was asking to take on this major role in my wedding. Like none of the past mattered, like he hadn't ignored me for years. I tried to stay calm. "I haven't thought about it yet," I replied, trying to dodge the question. But my dad wasn't going to let it go. He went on to say how it would be embarrassing for the family if he didn't walk me down the aisle, that people would start asking questions, and it would reflect poorly on them. He was making it about appearances, not about me or what I wanted. It was all about saving faces. I couldn't hold back any longer. I told him I wasn't even sure I'd be inviting them to the wedding, let alone having him walk me down the aisle. That's when things got heated. My mom jumped in, telling me how disappointed she was in me and how I was being disrespectful. She went on about how family is family and that I should just let the past go. They acted like all the years of neglect and favoritism toward Vicky didn't mean anything, like I should just sweep it under the rug and pretend it never happened. Part of me wanted to believe them, to give them a chance. I'd spent so many years hoping they would change, that maybe, just maybe, this was their way of trying. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that their call wasn't about mending our relationship. It was about appearances, about saving their reputation. And I wasn't about to let them use my wedding to do that. I ended the call by telling my dad that I'd think about it. But deep down, I knew I didn't want him walking me down the aisle. The people who had truly been there for me, who had loved and supported me through everything, were my grandparents. They were the ones who deserved to stand by my side on that day, not my parents. As the wedding planning continued, I reached out to my old high school friends. The same group of girls who had stood by me when Vicky tried to sabotage my friendships years ago. We'd stayed close despite living in different cities, and I wanted them to be my bridesmaids. When I told them, there were happy tears and virtual hugs through video calls. They were thrilled to be part of my big day, and we made plans to celebrate with a bachelorette party in Vegas. It was going to be the reunion of a lifetime. Vegas was amazing. We had so much fun, and it was a perfect escape from all the stress that came with wedding planning. We took a ton of pictures, and of course I posted some on Instagram. But when I got back, my parents called me again, and this time, they weren't congratulating me. Instead, they were furious. Apparently, Vicky had seen the pictures and was upset that I hadn't invited her to the bachelorette party. My parents demanded to know why I hadn't included her, insisting that it was my duty as her sister to involve her in these important events. I was shocked. I hadn't spoken to Vicky in years, and now, out of nowhere, they were expecting me to welcome her back into my life as if nothing had happened. I calmly told them that Vicky wasn't invited because I didn't want her there. I reminded them of everything she had done to me, how she had never apologized, and how she had made my life miserable growing up. I wasn't going to let her ruin one of the most important days of my life. My parents didn't care, predictably. They kept saying that Vicky was family and that I had no right to exclude her, but I wasn't backing down. I hung up the phone, feeling a mixture of anger and relief. I knew I had made the right choice, but it was hard standing up to them after all these years. My grandparents, as always, had my back. When I told them what had happened, they reassured me that I didn't owe anyone anything, least of all Vicky or my parents. As the wedding day got closer, I threw myself into the final details of the planning, trying to push away the lingering thoughts of my parents. I was excited, but there was still that small part of me that felt the sting of their rejection. I had been hoping deep down that maybe they'd realize how hurtful their actions had been and try to make things right. But as the days passed, that hope dimmed. About a week before the wedding, my dad called me. At first, I thought he was calling to check in, or maybe even to finally apologize for how they'd treated me. Instead, he dropped another bombshell. "Your mom and I have decided we won't be attending your wedding," he said, his voice completely matter-of-fact. "Vicky's housewarming party is the same day, and we're going to that instead." I was stunned into silence. I didn't even know what to say. My sister's housewarming party was more important than my wedding. This wasn't just about Vicky. It was a clear reminder of where I stood in their priorities. All the years of feeling second best, of being the afterthought, suddenly crystallized in that moment. "I see," I finally managed to say, trying to keep my voice steady. "Thanks for letting me know." And then I hung up the phone before I could let him hear the hurt in my voice. I sat there in silence for a while, letting the weight of what had just happened sink in. They weren't just skipping the wedding, they were choosing her over me again. And for what? A housewarming party? It wasn't even a life event like mine. It was just another excuse to avoid showing up for me, like they'd always done. When I told Rob about the call, he was furious. He couldn't believe how cold and detached my parents were being. "You deserve so much better than this," he said, holding me close. "They don't deserve to be a part of your day." His words comforted me, but the pain still lingered. That night, Rob suggested something that lifted my spirits. "Why don't you ask your grandparents to walk you down the aisle instead? They've been more of a family to you than your parents ever have." I hadn't even considered that, but as soon as he said it, it felt right. My grandparents had been there for me through everything. They had stepped up when my parents failed me, and they were the only ones who had never wavered in their love and support. The next day, I called my grandparents and asked them if they would do the honor of walking me down the aisle. As soon as the words left my mouth, my grandmother started crying. She passed the phone to my grandfather, who was already choked up. "Of course we'll walk you down the aisle, sweetheart," he said. It would mean the world to us, hearing their voices filled with emotion. I couldn't help but get teary-eyed too. For the first time since all this wedding chaos had started, I felt a sense of peace. I had made the right decision, and I knew my wedding day would be special because I would be surrounded by the people who truly loved me. As the wedding day grew closer, everything seemed to fall into place. My bridesmaids, those same friends from high school who had stood by me through thick and thin, were amazing. They were there for me every step of the way, from picking out my dress to calming my nerves when I felt overwhelmed. It was like having my own little army of love and support, and I knew I was incredibly lucky to have them in my life. Then, just 2 days before the wedding, my phone rang again. It was my dad. At first, I hesitated to answer, not wanting to ruin the positive energy I had been feeling. But curiosity got the better of me, and I picked up. "Is it true that your grandparents are walking you down the aisle?" he asked, his tone sharp. I took a deep breath. "Yes, it's true," I said firmly. "They're walking me down the aisle." He didn't like that. He went off on a rant about how disrespectful it was, how he and my mom had raised me and provided for me, and how it was their right to walk me down the aisle. It was as if he had completely forgotten that just days ago he had told me they wouldn't even be attending. Now he was acting like I had wronged him by asking my grandparents, when in reality, they had made the choice to prioritize Vicky's housewarming party over my wedding. I quote, "I'm sorry you feel that way," I said, keeping my voice steady. "But you made your choice, and now I've made mine." He didn't like that answer, and the conversation ended with him telling me how disappointed he was in me. But honestly, by that point, I didn't care anymore. I had spent so many years feeling like I wasn't good enough for them, always trying to win their approval. But now, standing just days away from marrying the love of my life, I realized I didn't need their approval. I had my own family, the family I had built with Rob, with my friends, and with my grandparents. The day of the wedding was beautiful. The sun was shining and everything went perfectly. My grandparents, holding my arms as we walked down the aisle, were beaming with pride. I could feel their love and support with every step, and it gave me the strength to move forward with my head held high. Rob looked at me with so much love in his eyes as I walked toward him, and at that moment, everything felt right. It didn't matter that my parents weren't there. It didn't matter that they had chosen Vicky's housewarming party over my wedding. What mattered was that I was surrounded by people who loved me, people who had always been there for me. The ceremony was filled with joy and laughter. My high school friends gave heartfelt speeches about our years of friendship, sharing memories that brought both tears and smiles. Rob's parents were so warm and welcoming, treating me as if I had always been a part of their family. And most importantly, I married the love of my life. That day was perfect in every way that mattered. After the wedding, Rob and I left for our honeymoon, a trip that his parents had gifted us. We spent 2 blissful weeks in a tropical paradise, just enjoying each other's company and soaking in the happiness of being newlyweds. It was everything I could have ever wanted, and for the first time in a long time, I felt truly at peace. When we returned from our honeymoon, I knew I had to take the next step. I blocked my parents on everything: phone, social media, email. I wasn't going to let them drag me back into the toxic cycle they had created. They had made their choice, and now I was making mine. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary for my own mental health and happiness. I haven't heard from them since, and honestly, I don't expect to. Part of me will always feel a little sad about how things turned out. But I also know that I deserve better than the way they treated me. I deserve to be loved, not as an afterthought, but as someone who matters. After our honeymoon, life slowly returned to normal. Rob and I moved into our new home, settling into married life with excitement and anticipation. It felt like the start of something truly beautiful. We spent our evenings talking about our dreams for the future, where we might travel, when we wanted to start a family, how we would build a life that was rooted in love, trust, and mutual respect. But even in this calm, new chapter of my life, I knew that the shadows of my past still lingered. The distance I had created with my parents was both a relief and a sadness. It was freeing to finally let go of the weight of their judgment and neglect. But I'd be lying if I said there weren't moments when I wondered what might have been different if they had chosen to love me as they loved Vicky. What if they had put in the effort to mend our relationship before it became too fractured? It had been about a month since the wedding when I stumbled across an unexpected email from Vicky. I hadn't checked my inbox in a while, assuming it would mostly be junk mail and post-wedding logistics, but there it was, an email from her, sitting unread in my inbox. My first instinct was to delete it without even opening it. After all, we hadn't spoken in years, and the memories of her betrayal still felt raw. But something stopped me, curiosity maybe, or the slightest hope that maybe, just maybe, she had changed. I opened the email, unsure of what I would find. It was a long message, filled with words I never thought I'd hear from Vicky. She apologized for everything. She wrote about how she had been selfish and immature, how she had let her jealousy and insecurities get the best of her, and how deeply she regretted the way she had treated me. She said that she understood why I hadn't invited her to the wedding, but that she hoped one day we could start to rebuild some kind of relationship. She also said that my parents missed me and that they were hurt by my decision to cut them off. She urged me to reconsider, saying that no matter what had happened, they were still my parents, and they cared about me in their own way. Reading her words, I felt a swirl of emotions. Part of me wanted to believe that she was sincere, and that this was the beginning of a new chapter for us. But another part of me, the part that had been burned so many times before, was skeptical. Could I really trust her? Could I trust my parents after everything they had put me through? I sat with the email for a while, thinking about what to do. Rob found me sitting on the couch, staring at my laptop, lost in thought. When he asked what was going on, I showed him the email. He read it quietly, then looked at me with those kind eyes of his. "What do you want to do?" he asked, his voice gentle. "I don't know," I admitted. Part of me wants to believe her, but another part of me feels like, I've moved on. I don't know if I can open that door again. Rob nodded, understanding. "You don't owe them anything," he reminded me. "But if you feel like you want to give them another chance, that's your decision too. Whatever you decide, I'll support you." His words gave me comfort, but they didn't make the decision any easier. I spent the next few days mulling over Vicky's email, weighing my options. Forgiveness wasn't something that could be rushed, and I wasn't sure if I was ready to forgive. Not just Vicky, but my parents as well. They had done so much damage over the years, and it would take more than an apology to repair that. Eventually, I decided that I wasn't ready to respond. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Forgiveness is a process, and I wasn't there yet. For now, I needed to focus on the life I was building with Rob, the life that was filled with love, support, and people who truly cared about me. Maybe one day I would be ready to sit down with Vicky and talk things through. But for now, I was choosing peace over the past. In the weeks that followed, I began seeing a therapist. Rob had encouraged me to do so, and I knew it was the right step. I needed to work through all the unresolved feelings from my childhood, the pain of being the forgotten child, and the resentment I held toward my parents and Vicky. Therapy was hard, but it was also healing. It helped me see that I wasn't responsible for the way my parents had treated me, and I didn't have to carry the burden of their neglect any longer. As I delved deeper into my therapy sessions, I started to unpack the complex emotions that had been buried for so long. I realized that I had spent much of my life trying to prove my worth to people who were never going to see it. I had sought validation from my parents, but they were too blinded by their favoritism to ever truly appreciate me for who I was. But now, I didn't need their approval. I had built a life for myself, surrounded by people who loved me for me. People like Rob, my grandparents, and my friends. They were my real family, the ones who had always been there, even when my parents weren't. The more I processed my past, the more I felt a sense of closure. My parents had made their choices, and I had made mine. And while I still felt sadness over what could have been, I no longer felt weighed down by it. I was free to live my life on my terms, without the constant need to seek their approval. My grandparents, who had always been my biggest supporters, continued to play a central role in my life. They were overjoyed to hear that Rob and I were talking about starting a family, and they couldn't wait to meet their future great-grandchildren. Every time I visited them, I was reminded of how lucky I was to have had them in my life. They had given me the love and stability that my parents never could, and I would always be grateful for that. As for my parents, I didn't hear from them again after the wedding. Whether they truly missed me, as Vicky claimed, or whether they were content with their life centered around her, I didn't know. And honestly, I didn't care. I had made peace with the fact that our relationship might never be repaired. I had done everything I could, and it was up to them to decide if they wanted to change. But I wasn't going to hold my breath waiting for that day. Months passed, and life continued to move forward. Rob and I were happy, planning for our future, and savoring the quiet, everyday moments that made our life together so special. I had learned that happiness didn't come from chasing after people who didn't value me. It came from being surrounded by those who did. In the end, I realized that family isn't just about blood. It's about the people who show up for you. The ones who love you unconditionally. The ones who stand by your side through the highs and the lows. and I had found my family in the people who mattered most. As I closed the chapter on my relationship with my parents, I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't felt in years. I didn't know what the future held for me and Vicky, or if we would ever truly reconcile. But for now, I was content with where I was. I had found my own happiness, and that was more than enough. And that's how I learned to choose myself after a lifetime of being told I wasn't enough. Story 2, after being disconnected for years. Sit me down, parents, and hand me a letter. They say it's time for me to take a chance and assist the golden kid in treating her infertility when I open it. It was always obvious to me as a child that my sister Mary was the favorite. She is now 33 years old, 2 years older than me, and in my parents' eyes, she seemed to be impervious to harm. She was the quintessential golden kid, after all. My mother would constantly boast about her intelligence, athleticism, and beauty. In essence, she fulfilled every desire they had. They would even refer to her as their baby pie or golden apple. In the meantime, I always felt like an afterthought in the background. Let's just say that I was not included in the plan because I was born 2 years after Mary. My parents made no secret of the fact that I was unexpected. In addition, I had a cardiac issue and was born prematurely. They started to treat me differently because of the entire health problem. Throughout my youth, I spent a lot of time in and out of hospitals, and each time they would say something passive-aggressive about how much money I was costing them. My mother would remark things like, "We'd be better off if we didn't have these medical bills, more times than I can count." I always felt like a burden because of it. Here's the problem though, most of it was not even paid for by them. Everything the insurance didn't cover was covered by my grandparents. My parents, however, continued to harbor animosity toward me. In retrospect, I doubt they ever forgiven me for having a heart issue from birth. They seemed irritated that I was a flawed kid or something. Mary was being treated like a queen while they were busy treating me like a waste of their money. She received all of the attention and accolades, always the attractive one. She was the top athlete, and they pretended that she was a divine gift of some kind. It wasn't just my parents either. Mary was also involved in this whole situation. She made the most of the fact that she was the favorite. She treated me badly, bullying me outright. My parents just dismissed it. She once pushed me down the stairs after I unintentionally touched her school assignment. As I recall. For weeks, I had a bruise on my back. My mother's response. She advised me to exercise greater caution when handling Mary's belongings. Unless I was bothering them, I seemed to be invisible. That was a lonely way to grow up. You would expect that we would be close because I have an elder sister. However, she didn't want to interact with me unless it was to ridicule me or hold me accountable. My parents simply allowed it to occur. Not that they were blind to what was happening, they simply didn't give a damn. To them, Mary was flawless, while I was only present. My only way out was to go to school. Even so, it wasn't simple. I was constantly behind since I missed a lot of days due to my health problems. Naturally, Mary would attend all of her sporting events and receive perfect scores. My parents never missed a game or school function for Mary, but they seldom ever attended anything for me, even though I was having trouble keeping up. I once asked them to attend the ceremony after receiving an award for a short piece I had written. They didn't. They claimed to be too preoccupied with Mary's soccer match. Nor was it only the important things. It was also the small things. Mary would throw these large, lavish parties for our birthdays, just as she did every year. She had a ton of people over, along with decorations and themes. I usually had quieter, smaller birthdays. Not even a proper celebration was given to me. They would frequently just respond, "Oh, we'll do something next weekend," and then go on. Observing my parents' joy while they were with Mary was the hardest part. They seemed to have changed as individuals. When it was just the two of us, they laughed and smiled more. They seemed unsure of how to behave around me, and there was an odd tension. I had mastered the art of simply keeping my head down by the time I reached high school. I didn't want to upset anyone. Mary was doing well for herself already. She had a ton of friends and was headed to a fantastic college. Me? All I wanted was to survive each day without feeling inadequate. But with my parents continually comparing us, even that was difficult. "Why are you unable to emulate Mary more? She's doing so great," they say. "You ought to put forth more effort." I had the feeling that nothing I did was sufficient. They would simply ignore it, even if I did something correctly, like completing a school assignment or earning high grades. However, they would be all over me the moment I made a mistake. When I had received a C in arithmetic, my mother lost it. She pretended that I had wrecked my future. In the meanwhile, they would simply laugh it off and Mary could get away with anything. Constantly coming in second was taxing. I knew my family didn't truly care about me, so I never felt like I could be myself around them. The non-existent version of me was important to them. The one who could keep up with Mary, who wasn't always ill, and who didn't have a heart disease. However, I wasn't that person. And it would never be. When I graduated from high school, it was the major turning point in my life. I had had enough of the whole thing. All I wanted to do was go. I pleaded with my grandparents to pay for my distant college education. Where didn't matter to me. All I had to do was distance myself from my family. The only people who ever truly helped me were my grandparents. May they rest in peace. I went to college several states away, and they paid for it. The satisfaction of leaving for the first time in my life is beyond words. I was not a shadow of Mary. Without being reminded of how much I was costing my parents or continually compared to her, I could just be me. Taking a look back, the thought of how much they altered my mind is insane. For years, I believed that I was a burden and that I was unworthy. However, I now see it for what it was, a disaster, favoritism that they attempted to disguise as commonplace. I managed to get away, but the harm had already been done. Years passed before I was able to get rid of the sense that I had no value. I still have periods of self-doubt and question whether they were correct about me all along. It wasn't my fault though, I assure myself. It wasn't. Things really started to change for me once I moved away to attend college. I had the impression that a burden had been removed. To be honest, the greatest thing I could have done for myself was to be away from Mary and my parents. It offered me a fresh start free from the trash that accompanied being the unwanted child. For the first time, I could be myself. I met my spouse Greg at college. I recall our initial encounter. It happened during one of those uncomfortable dorm icebreakers. He was just being his true, compassionate self, which was more than I had anticipated. I had never met anyone like him. It was really wonderful that Greg didn't worry about appearances or what I could do for him. Following a lifetime of believing that I was unworthy of anybody, including my own family. Greg and I clicked right away. Something I wasn't used to was his patience with me. When I told him about my early years and how I always felt like I was in the background, he listened and didn't pass judgment. He just gave me a sense of value and significance that I had never experienced before. He also gave me a sense of beauty, which was something else I wasn't used to as a child. Mary was always the attractive one, and I was often compared to her. At the very least, Greg told me that I was never competent enough in that area. I didn't think I had to be competitive. For the first time in my life, I began to think that perhaps I wasn't as useless as my parents made me feel, since he loved me for who I was. Greg asked me to marry him after we graduated, and I accepted without hesitation. We soon began organizing the wedding, and Greg's family was incredibly helpful. They volunteered to assist with the wedding expenses since they were so excited about the whole situation. Not so much with my family, though. When I announced my impending marriage to my parents, they didn't even act like they were pleased for me. We recently spent a lot of money on Mary's wedding last year, so don't expect us to help out, my mom remarked bluntly. I didn't even feel like their daughter. Even though I made an effort to ignore it, it still stung. I mean, I wasn't asking for anything really fancy. All I wanted was for them to be there, to care, to support me. However, they were unable to even achieve that. They were not present for the wedding. Nor my father, nor my mother, and most certainly not Mary. Not even a card was sent. Nothing. To them, I seemed to have vanished, which, to be honest, wasn't all that different from my childhood. However, I wasn't going to let that spoil my day. There was Greg's family, and they were fantastic. They gave me the impression that I was a part of something genuine, as if I had at last the family I had always desired. Even though it seemed like a little thing, Greg's mother helped me choose my wedding gown. And that meant a lot to me. I felt like I belonged anywhere for the first time when she treated me like her own daughter. We had a lovely wedding. Although it wasn't as grand and elaborate as Mary's, it was ideal for us. It seemed like a new beginning for both Greg and myself when we were married in the city where we graduated. We made the decision to relocate there, distant from my family's poisonous disaster back home. I maintained communication with my grandparents, of sure, but I seldom ever talked to Mary or my parents outside of them. It was a nice life. Together, Greg and I created a life free from the relentless need to prove myself to uncaring others. It was the first time I felt truly joyful. Then came the news that made all the difference. When I discovered that I was a combination of emotions, I was pregnant. Naturally, I was thrilled, but my heart issue also made me nervous. I was aware of the dangers of pregnancy. It was genuine, even though my physicians had warned me about it for years. When I informed Greg, he was ecstatic, but I could also see the concern in his eyes. We were both aware that the road ahead would not be simple. Naturally, the pregnancy was difficult. My physicians told me to end it early since it may be fatal for me, but I couldn't do it because of the problems that started practically immediately. I just couldn't bring myself to do it. Even though Greg was terrified, he agreed with my choice. Both of us were. The next months were the most difficult of my life. I was under continual observation and in and out of the hospital. My heart was under a lot of stress, and there were days when I didn't think I would survive. But I did, in spite of all the odds. Both of us did. I barely made it through, and my kid was delivered healthy. The physicians were unambiguous. They made it clear to me that I couldn't take the chance of getting another kid. Once more, my heart simply could not bear it. Greg and I both agreed. We didn't want to push our luck because we were content with our small family. In retrospect, I'm not sure how I survived that period without going insane. Greg was my pillar of support during the entire terrible ordeal. He was always at my side. Never gave me the impression that I was working alone, and I will always remember that. In my life, he has been the one constant, the one person who has consistently supported me, following the birth of our son. There was silence for a time. Our priorities were raising him and simply living life to the fullest. Although it wasn't simple, it was ours. And for me, it was sufficient. I had at last created something positive that wasn't connected to the rejection and suffering I had experienced as a child. It was mine, even though it wasn't flawless. We had been living in silence for a few years when something unexpected happened. My hometown is where we now reside. But that wasn't really a conscious decision. My grandpa was the only member of my family who I truly cared about, and his health had quickly begun to deteriorate. The last thing I wanted was for him to die away without me around as he grew older. After discussing it, Greg and I made the decision to relocate back to be close to him. Being back did not excite me. To be honest, I was already anxious at the prospect of seeing Mary and my parents again. I didn't expect any miracles in the years that followed, and I understood how things were before I went. But I didn't want to regret not being there for my grandfather, and that was more important to me than resolving old family issues. I made an effort to stay away when we initially returned. We relocated to a location on the opposite side of town, far enough away that we could avoid seeing my family unless we so desired. I reasoned that I would just go see my grandparents, see how they were doing, and stay away from my parents as much as possible. That was the strategy. At least when it comes to family, however, naturally, things seldom go as planned, does it? Mary and my folks started acting strangely as soon as we returned, as in, really distinct. My mother called me out of the blue to check on me and to express her pride in all that I had achieved. Where was all of this while I was growing up, really? They appeared to have chosen to become a loving family all of a sudden. They weren't. Every few days, my father would text me to inquire about Greg and my adjustment. Mary, who had always acted as though I was beneath her, was suddenly very kind and tried to talk to me whenever we crossed paths. But I was not buying it. Just because you moved back home doesn't mean you suddenly become the beloved child after being treated like shit your entire life. The entire event seemed strange, but I couldn't identify what it was. There was a part of me that hoped they had changed, that they had come to terms with their terrible behavior, and that this was their way of atoning. But I knew better in my heart. It takes years of that sort of therapy to go away. When I brought it up to my grandmother, she advised me to give them a chance since perhaps they really miss me. I'm not sure. Perhaps they did. I wasn't going to let my guard down entirely, but I was prepared to maintain an open mind. My parents then asked us over for supper 2 weeks after we had returned. I've already attended enough family meals with them to understand that the conversation generally goes beyond food. An agenda of some sort is always present. Greg, however, persuaded me that perhaps it was only a kind gesture. Perhaps they were attempting to get back in touch or anything. So we went against my better judgment. At first, everything appeared regular when we arrived at their home. One of the few things I truly missed from my childhood was my mom's delicious lasagna. I could almost mislead myself that it was just another family meal as we sat around the table chit-chatting. However, Mary told me she had a surprise for me midway through the lunch. She was seated across from me, and I felt sick to my stomach at the smug smirk on her face. For Mary, surprises were never pleasant. Taking a card out of her bag, she reached. She gave it to me as if it were a prize, and it was one of those elegant-looking envelopes. Despite my confusion, I opened it in the hopes of receiving an apology or a thank you card for returning to be nearer to the family. However, it wasn't the case. Not even near. There was a note inside congratulating me on becoming the bearer of her future child. I'm not kidding. Like I should be honored or something, she wrote it, as if risking my life for her was some sort of privilege. This has to be some sort of prank, I thought at first. However, I could tell she was quite serious by the expression on her face. It seemed unbelievable to me. As I tried to comprehend what was occurring, I simply sat there looking at the card. When I was able to talk at last, I informed her that I was physically incapable of carrying another child. I nearly died during my son's pregnancy, and the doctors were quite clear that I couldn't experience that again. Before I could even finish explaining it, Mary started crying. Now, if she had wept, I wouldn't have bothered, but my parents responded right away. My mom added that I should do something for family when my dad began to rage at me for being self-centered. It seemed as though they were completely unaware of my heart condition and the risks associated with having another child. The whole situation escalated into a heated confrontation in which Mary and my parents attacked me, accusing me of being a bad sister for not wanting to support her. I was stunned. I made an effort to maintain my position, but it was difficult when everyone was yelling at me as if I were the worst person alive. Thank God, Greg was there for me the entire time. He got up and informed them that this was crazy and that they had no right to demand me to do this. He also said that we were going. After gathering our belongings, we left. It was a calm journey home. I believe that both of us were simply stunned by what had just transpired. I still find it hard to comprehend the sheer insolence of it all. The idea that they felt it was okay to simply throw this on me, to assume that I would risk my life to carry her child without even asking me beforehand, is terrible. I understand that Mary is distraught about not being able to have children. It is completely screwed up. Since that evening, I have not communicated with them. A part of me is guilty, as in, perhaps I ought to have handled it differently. However, I am aware that I made the correct decision. I prioritize my health, always. After that dinner, there was an overwhelming silence. I went days without hearing from Mary or my parents. A part of me hoped they would at least try to get in touch to explain themselves or something, but I wasn't expecting them to apologize. However, there was radio silence. Greg insisted that I was correct to stand my ground, and I knew in my heart that I had done the right thing. I don't know though, it still made me feel guilty. Even though I shouldn't have, I felt that way. It's strange how family can cause such mental turmoil. The thing that most annoyed me was how fast things changed. They act as though they missed me one moment, as if they're really pleased with me. Then they're yelling at me for not putting my life in danger for Mary. Who, after all, does that? Who can go from 0 to 100 so quickly? I felt like a tool that had been stored for years, and they needed me now. I was expected to seize the opportunity to assist. The thing is, though, I wasn't shocked. Sure, disappointed, but not shocked. It had always been like this. Mary's wish was fulfilled, regardless of the consequences, and I was always supposed to comply. I had seen it repeatedly as a child. Whether I was ill, struggling, or in pain didn't matter. If Mary had any needs, they turned their attention there. In the end, they didn't give a damn about the effects of my pregnancy. What it could do for her was all that mattered to them. A few more weeks went by and I started to get used to the idea that maybe I wouldn't talk to my family again. I mean, how do you come back from something like that? I couldn't just pretend that dinner never happened, and I sure wasn't about to risk my life to carry a child that wasn't even mine. Greg and I talked about it a lot, and we both agreed that going no contact might be the best thing for us, for our family. My son didn't need to grow up around people who treated his mom like that. Then one day out of nowhere, I got a message from my mom. It wasn't long, just a text that said we need to talk. No, I apologize. No, let's work this out. Just a cold, emotionless, we must speak. I gazed at my phone for what felt like forever, trying to determine what to do. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to block her number and move on with my life. But the other half of me, the one that still desired some type of affirmation from my family, wanted to know what she had to say. I showed Greg the message, and he was fairly forceful about it. He informed me that if I answered, I needed to be ready for more drama. He was correct, of course, but I still couldn't help myself. Against my better judgment, I answered. I kept things basic. Just asked, "What do you want to talk about?" Her reaction came immediately. She stated she wanted to meet, that it was important. I asked if Greg could come too, and she quickly replied no. That was a red sign if I'd ever seen one. Why couldn't my hubby be there? I had nothing to conceal, really. And shouldn't he be participating as well if this was truly about making things right? But no, she claimed that I was the only one. I consented to meet her in spite of all the red flags. I have no idea what I was anticipating. Perhaps a sincere apology, or at the very least an admission of their wrongdoing. However, I ought to have known better. We met in a local coffee shop that I hadn't visited in a long time. She was sitting there drinking her drink as if it were any other day when I strolled in. Not guilty. She had no regret on her face, simply informal, as if this were a typical mother-daughter catch-up. She began chatting as soon as I sat down, before I could even say anything. She made no mention of the supper or inquired about my well-being. She went straight in, telling me that Mary was distraught and that I should think again about what I had done. I was hearing things that I couldn't believe. No one apologized. No, we were mistaken. Once more, it was all about Mary. She went on and on about how difficult Mary's life had been, how she and her father had been trying to find answers, and how I was the only one who could help. I sat there in complete shock. Even the family sticks were brought together by her. Anything from someone who had disregarded me for years meant a card like that. I gently informed her that my response had not altered when she eventually paused to catch her breath. I was unable to accomplish it. No, I wouldn't. I informed her that I wasn't willing to take the chance of getting pregnant again because of the doctor's warning about how risky it would be for me, not for everyone. I hoped that perhaps, just perhaps, she would comprehend. Rather, she regarded me as though I were a monster. She said, "You're being self-centered. You are simply ignoring Mary when she needs you." It seemed unbelievable to me. She had the audacity to accuse me of being selfish after everything I had endured and years of being treated like a nobody. I assured her that I was defending my family and myself and wasn't abandoning anybody. However, she was unwilling to listen to it. She persisted in pressuring and attempting to use guilt to get me to comply. It seemed as though my words had no significance. I came to the realization that there was one element about my family that would never change. Mary would always be viewed as superior to me, and no matter how hard I tried to explain myself or what I did, they would never get it. They believed that I was here to help her. And I turned into the villain the instant I said no. After telling her I was finished, I got up and left the coffee shop. I didn't turn around. I didn't hold off till she answered. I had had enough of the manipulation, the guilt, and the never-ending sense that I was never good enough. I refused to be dragged back into their poisonous quagmire. Not any longer. Greg was waiting for me when I arrived home, and I filled him in on everything. It did not surprise him. Like me, he was aware that things would always be this way. Now, however, I felt something for the first time in a long time. Relief. After informing my mother I was done and leaving the coffee shop, I was at last free. I genuinely believed that may be the last of it. After all, how many times must you slam the door before someone realizes you won't be opening it again? Naturally, though, they missed the clue. My dad began texting me a few days after the entire discussion with my mom. Once again, it was the same thing. I heard what occurred from your mom, and we need to make things right. The family is being torn apart by you. Destroying the family? Really? The fact that they never mentioned the years of neglect is amusing, or the treatment I received as a child. However, because I refused to give them what they desire, I am now the one destroying the family. It was so normal. Everything was constantly turned upside down, making me the villain in some manner. I never even answered his mails. I was unable to. I had had enough of trying to justify myself to folks who obviously didn't give a damn about me. However, it didn't end there. It was exploding up on my phone. Naturally, Mary also began texting. Her communications were far more heated, though she didn't even make an effort to hide her anger. How could you be so self-centered? This is something you owe me. Without a doubt, I would do it for you. That was a falsehood to start. If I were Mary, she wouldn't even carry my child, let alone do anything for me. When we were younger, she refused to even give me a ride to school. If it didn't get in her way. I have no idea who she was trying to mislead, but it wasn't me, her entire being. For you, I would do everything. Act was only another tactic she used to coerce me into complying with her wishes. I simply couldn't handle the constant barrage of mails any longer. It seemed like they wouldn't accept it no matter how many times I said no. Greg insisted that I simply cut them off entirely and block their phones. But you know it's difficult. Making the decision to cut off your family is a big one. Additionally, I was aware that it was most likely the greatest thing for my mental health. There was still a part of me that wished to maintain some relationship. I suppose that I wasn't quite prepared to let go. Despite anything. After a few more weeks, all was calm once more. I must admit that I was a little uncomfortable when I didn't hear from them. I continued to wait for the next round of manipulation or guilt trips, but nothing materialized. I made an effort to concentrate on my small family. I needed to focus my energies on Greg and our son, since they were my entire universe. However, I had a sneaking suspicion that something more was on the horizon. It was only a question of time. Then it took place. Unexpectedly, my grandma called me one day. She has consistently been the only member of my family who has given me genuine support. I thus took up my phone as soon as I saw her name. I thought she would check in or inquire about how things were doing, as she normally did. However, I could detect the stress in her voice as soon as I spoke. I'm not sure how to break the news to you, sweetie, but your folks are organizing something. You must be ready. I felt sick to my stomach. What are you saying? Organizing a project? Trying to speak steadily, I asked. They are discussing seeing a lawyer. They threaten to sue you if you don't agree to assist Mary. You mean anything medical? Surrogacy? They're serious, but I'm not sure. I was hearing things that I couldn't believe. Legal action. In fact, they intended to try to coerce me into doing this. I couldn't speak. My grandma continued by informing me that she heard them discussing their case and their belief that they could persuade a court to consider me as their final resort. I couldn't decide whether to laugh or cry because Mary couldn't conceive on her own. This was above my wildest expectations. They genuinely believed they could force me to have Mary's child in court. The concept was horrifying and absurd all at once. Who, after all, thinks that way? Who goes that far? We hung up after I thanked my grandmother for telling me. Just trying to take it all in, I sat there looking at my phone. I experienced a mixture of incredulity, rage, and sheer exasperation. How could this have happened? How did my own relatives become the ones who would attempt to use the law to make me put my life in danger for my sister? When I considered all the years of being ignored and constantly ranked behind Mary, I came to the conclusion that this was the last straw. I was no longer able to do it. I told Greg everything that night. It did not surprise him. Furious? Indeed. But taken aback. No. Like me, he was aware that this was simply another tactic they used to manipulate me and make me feel as though I owed them something. However, I owed them nothing. Not any longer. To be cautious, Greg advised that we get in touch with a lawyer. As crazy as that seemed, we had to be ready for whatever they tried. So we did. A few days later, we met with a lawyer, and I gave them the rundown. The lawyer was fantastic. He was sympathetic and prepared to defend us if necessary. She told me that I could not be coerced into being a surrogate, particularly in light of my medical background. However, she acknowledged that it was preferable to be ready in case they did do something. I waited a few weeks and heard nothing. No threats from the law. Mary and my parents have stopped texting. I knew it wasn't over, even if it seemed like they had finally backed off. The harm was already done. I couldn't return to acting as though nothing was wrong. There was no turning back now that they had revealed their true selves to me. My mother unexpectedly sent me a parting message one day. As previously, it was chilly and brief. "You have let us down. You have disappointed the family." And that was all. No justification. No more remorse trips. I only needed that final blow to be reminded of their true feelings. I spent some time looking at the message. I can feel it stinging. But then I came to a realization. I was no longer concerned. I didn't feel bad about myself. The failure had not been mine. All my life they had failed me. And this was only the last part of a lengthy, agonizing tale. After that, I banned their numbers. Although difficult, it was essential. Greg and I made the decision to go on without them for the benefit of our baby and our own mental health. I refused to give up myself for those who didn't care about me, and they weren't going to change. Life has calmed down during the past few months. I still occasionally think about them, but not depressed. It quotes more like relief. I'm relieved to be free of their demands, manipulation, and control at last. Now that I have my own family, it is all I require. Story 3. My stepmother detested me, so at the age of 13, Dad kicked me out. He wants me back now. The lockdowns in 2020 marked the beginning of all of this. At the age of 13, I was living in Houston, and my relationship with my stepmother Laura was going rather well. To be honest, I thought of her as a second mother. We always got along, and she had been here for a long time. I liked being around her, and she was kind to me. She never gave me the impression that she treated me any differently than she would have her own child. I was thrilled for her when she said she was expecting. Due to the pandemic, my biological mother, Rachel, a surgeon, was working really hard at the time. I ended up spending the lockout with my dad, David, and Laura because of her hectic schedule. With everything going on, what was meant to be a brief visit ended up lasting far longer than anyone had anticipated. At first, everything appeared to be normal. We were all only attempting to survive the lockdown by hanging around, watching movies and other activities. I reasoned that more time with them would be pleasant, especially since Laura was expecting a child. I anticipated playing a significant role in this new era, being a great big sister and helping out with the baby. However, it was not the case. Things began to change when Laura was around 4 months along in her pregnancy. Little things were involved at start. I would think, well, maybe she's just having a rough day, when she would lash out at me over something trivial. She was pregnant, cooped up at home, and under lockdown stress after all. It wasn't a huge problem, so I tried to ignore it, correct? However, it continued. It really became worse. Much worse. Suddenly, I felt like I was bothering her with everything I did. I'm not even a messy child either. I'm rather tidy. I performed what I was expected to do, helped out with the housework, and complied with the home rules. But nothing I did pleased her. She would sigh aloud as if my presence were spoiling her day when she entered a room and saw me sitting there. She seemed to no longer want to be around me, and I was at a loss as to what I had done wrong. I began to stay in my room most of the time. I simply kept out of the way so as not to exacerbate the situation. Other than coming out to get food or do chores, I made an effort to blend in. She would still become angry even then. She once stormed into my room, screaming that the stench was so strong that it was making her ill. I couldn't see what she was talking about when I looked around. A half-eaten bag of chips on my desk was the only item inside. And that's it. She broke down in tears before I had a chance to respond, as if I had done something awful. As usual, my dad came running in to reassure her that everything was fine and to attempt to calm her down. I stood there in utter confusion, wondering what had occurred. Although it didn't feel like hormones to me, they blamed it on her pregnancy, claiming that the hormones were making her more sensitive. She seemed to truly despise me, but nobody was willing to acknowledge it. That day wasn't the only one either. She seemed to be upset at everything I did. She would come in and get upset that I wasn't helping out around the home, even though I had already finished my daily tasks, while I was sitting peacefully reading or watching anything on my phone. Sometimes, even when I was really in the middle of washing a dish, she would walk in and complain that I wasn't cleaning up quickly enough while I was in the kitchen eating a snack. The most detrimental aspect? My father didn't stand up for me, not once. He would simply stand there and attempt to soothe her whenever she became emotional, asking me to be more understanding or that she was going through a lot because of her pregnancy. However, he never inquired about my emotional state. It seemed as though I had no significance. I was simply there when I began to feel completely alienated in my own house. I felt like I had to tread carefully around them and just to be in the same room with them. I made an effort to discuss it with my dad and ask him why Laura was treating me this way, but he consistently dismissed my attempts. He would say things like, "She's just having a hard time, she doesn't mean it," or "she's just stressed." It didn't feel like she didn't mean it though after a time. She seemed to. I became so resentful that I didn't want to leave my room. My mental state deteriorated. I began to feel unwelcome and like an inconvenience. There. At night, I would lie in bed fearing that my father might just order me to go. My hair literally began to come out because I was so anxious. I recall taking handfuls of it and sat there in disbelief, wondering how things had spiraled out of control so quickly. I truly made an effort to improve the situation. In an effort to be as helpful and out of the way as possible, I began taking on extra duties. I would take care of the washing, the cooking, everything. But it wasn't enough. No matter what I did, there will always be something for Laura to gripe about. It would be the way I folded the towels one day. I would then be accused of leaving a cup in the sink for an extended period of time. Something was always there. It wasn't simply the tasks either. It was the household strain. The air was heavy, as if everything may blow up at any moment. I was unable to unwind and simply be a typical child in my own house. Every time I had to leave my room, I hated it. I tried using headphones to block out everything, but it didn't help. The tension was oppressive. I knew deep down that I was breaking, but I tried to pretend it didn't affect me. All I wanted was to return to my mother's home. But I was stranded because of the epidemic and her insane work schedule. It was like walking a tightrope every day. I had no idea when my dad would ultimately inform me that I was no longer welcome, or when Laura would lose it again. Laura might not have wanted me there at all. The more I considered the possibility, that thought stayed with me, and it made me nervous since, at 13, I had no clue where I would go if things worsened. Although I had no answers, I was certain of one thing. From here, things could only get worse. I was sitting in the kitchen, attempting to pass the time by browsing through my phone on a typical day, or as typical as things could get in that house. Since I wasn't doing anything unusual, I can still clearly recall it. I wasn't being noisy, creating a mess or anything. All I did was sit there and wait for my cereal to become wet. That's how I like it. I know it's strange, but I've always eaten it that way. Laura entered as I was taking care of myself. She remained silent at first. She simply stood there scanning the area as if she were trying to identify a problem. The kitchen was immaculate. I had cleaned it that morning after all. The dishes were finished, counters are cleaned, everything had a place. Still, however, she sighed as if she was incredulous at what she was witnessing. I felt like I was the cause of all her issues simply by being in that area. Then she began cleaning, washing the countertops with such force that it sounded like she was scrubbing concrete and clattering dishes in the sink. She is doing this the entire time. She's whispering to herself that the kitchen was always a wreck and that some people don't know how to clean up after themselves. I know that if I say something, it will blow up, so I'm just sitting there looking at my cereal and trying not to react. However, she then did something that really irritated me. She came over, took my cereal bowl, which I hadn't even touched yet, and tossed it in the garbage. Without hesitation, simply threw it away. Not like there was a major mess or anything. Not even a drop of milk had been spilled. She seemed to be deliberately demonstrating that my actions were irrelevant. It seemed unbelievable to me. Who simply discards food in that manner? I lost my temper. All the tension and annoyance I had suppressed for months just emerged. I shouted, "What's wrong with me?" and banged my hands on the table. Her eyes widened as if she hadn't anticipated my retaliation. "Why are you so hostile toward me? You treat me like garbage even though I haven't done anything wrong." At first she didn't answer, as if no one had ever called her out before. I just stood there in disbelief. Then, as if on cue, she began to scream uncontrollably and acted as though I had just spoken something. Before I could speak another word, the worst thing that could ever happen, When Laura starts weeping, my dad, David, rushes in from the living room like he usually does. "What's happening?" he inquired. However, it was one of those inquiries for which he had no real desire to get a response. Before I could even speak, he was already siding with her. She began to cry as she spoke, claiming that she was stressed out by me, that I was making her feel uneasy in her own house, and that she was reaching her breaking point. My dad didn't ask for my side, which was something I was hoping he would at least do. Rather, he faced me and said, "What did you do?" As if it was my fault automatically. She was crying like that, like if I had done something so terrible. It seemed unbelievable to me. I was dumbfounded and just gazed at him. Then Laura revealed the shocking information. She continued to cry as she replied, "I don't want her around my baby." This worry is too much for me to bear. Not only is it bad for myself, but it's also bad for the unborn child. She must go. My dad led me to my room at that point. As if I had done something incorrectly, he shut the door behind us and gave me a look as if he were ready to say something significant. I could feel my heart racing because I knew deep down that whatever he said next would completely alter our relationship. He responded, "You must be doing something to Laura. Nobody dislikes a child without cause. You'll have to go if you don't stop making her feel anxious. She's pregnant, and I can't have her this sad. She is not benefiting from it. It's also bad for the infant." The floor seemed to have fallen out from under me. I was unable to comprehend his words. Instead of defending me or even attempting to ascertain the situation, Laura wanted me out of the house. My father simply took her side. It seemed as though I had no significance, as if I were only an issue that required resolution. I was at a loss for words as I stood there looking at him. My mind was racing with a million ideas, but none of them made sense. This crushing weight in my chest was all I could feel, as if I were choking. I simply nodded, picked up a bag, and began packing some clothing because I had no idea what to do. In any case, I no longer wanted to be there. Not after all that had transpired. After returning to my room and locking the door, I asked on social media whether anyone had a place to host me. I gave a thorough explanation of the circumstances, leaving nothing out. Whether others thought I was being theatrical or not didn't matter to me. I simply had to leave. Almost instantly, my phone began to explode, but I chose to ignore it. I climbed out the window after grabbing my backpack and packing some clothing inside. It wasn't difficult. It wasn't as if I hadn't done it before and my room was on the ground floor. All I wanted was to be somewhere other than there. At first, I had no idea where I was going, but I reasoned that I could spend some time staying at a friend's house. I couldn't bear to spend any more time in that house. Not after my father's remarks. Before I even considered turning my phone back on, I had been walking for about half an hour. Messages came pouring in. Laura, my dad, and others are leaving comments on my post. None of them were read by me. I simply shut it off once more and continued to walk. My friends' parents allowed me to spend the night at their home after I ended up there. I kept some things from them. Simply put, I needed a place to crash because things were difficult at home. I was thankful they didn't ask any questions. I sent my mom a text message on my friend's phone to inform her of the situation. She was unable to call me immediately. Although she was undergoing surgery, she promised to send my aunt to come get me the following day. I was satisfied with that. All I needed was a vacation from it all. I couldn't stop thinking about what my dad had said by the time I finally passed out that evening. Nobody dislikes a child without cause. I couldn't get that sentence out of my head, and the more I thought about it, the more irate I became. What made him think that? How was he able to assume that I was the issue? That I deserved this because of something I did? To make things easier for everyone, I had done everything in my power to avoid getting in the way of Laura's efforts to help out around the house. And they treated me like this. I had no idea what would happen next, but I was certain that I would never return to that house. Not after their remarks the morning after my departure. I felt a little numb when I woke up at my friend's house. Almost as if it hadn't hit me yet. Everything that had transpired the previous evening was still circling around in my mind. It hadn't quite dawned on me that this might be permanent, even though I knew I wouldn't be returning to my dad's house. The parents of my friend were very kind and didn't make any awkward inquiries. I just had breakfast and was allowed to relax in their living room. I was unwilling to discuss what had transpired. I was still attempting to take it all in. I was still unsure of my feelings about it, mostly just tired, like emotionally drained. Do you know? Around midday my Aunt Maggie showed up. She gave me that concerned look you get when people know something's wrong, but don't want to make it worse by asking too many questions. We didn't say much to each other at first. She just helped me grab my stuff from my friend's place and drove me back to her house. I was relieved, honestly. I always felt safe at Maggie S. She S, that cool aunt who always gets it, never judges and knows when you just need space. As we pulled up to her house, I finally turned my phone back on. Big mistake. My phone blew up with texts and calls, mostly from my dad. He must have tried calling me, at least 20 times the night before. There were messages to some from him, some from Laura, but also a few from members in the family. Probably after my dad's post about my going away. I didn't bother reading all of them at first, just too much. I needed a vacation from all that. But I did contact my mom to let her know I was okay, even though she already knew, since she and Maggie had chatted. I didn't want her worrying more than she already was with all the work stress. She texted me back soon quickly, stating she was pleased I was okay and suggested we chat when she could find a break from the hospital. I figured my dad must have been losing it after learning I wasn't at the house, especially when I didn't answer to his calls. But to be honest, I didn't give a damn. He's the one who basically informed me I wasn't wanted there. What did he expect? I didn't feel like dealing with his explanations or hearing him attempt to make it look like it was my fault. Not after what he'd said to me the night before. However, while I sat there, the larger consequences kept coming to me. My grandparents were people I knew. This was not going to be taken lightly by my dad's folks. Given that I didn't live with my dad full time, they were always quite protective of me. They would likely be upset with him for what transpired. When they learned the complete tale, I couldn't even begin to think what they would say. I eventually started reading some of the notes since I was so curious. The first was a lengthy one for my dad, in which he essentially apologized for the events that transpired, but continued to defend Laura by claiming that she was simply under stress from the pregnancy and that I should be more understanding. He seemed to be attempting to defend what had occurred during the entire speech, as if it were my duty to restore harmony by returning and resolving the issue. Then came the equally shorter but more annoying note from Laura. She didn't even recognize her treatment of me or offer an apology. She only expressed her wish that I was safe and advised me to consider the strain my departure had placed on the family. I was pretty annoyed by that one, as if she had the audacity to accuse me of being the source of the tension. Shortly thereafter, the family texts began to arrive. My grandparents were incensed. They didn't even send me a text. On social media, they immediately started criticizing my dad and wondering how he allowed things to become so terrible that I felt compelled to flee. It was a huge disaster for my dad, who had no idea that his post about me going missing was clearly intended to make people feel sorry for him. Everybody turned against him. People were wondering what was going on in that house and why his own daughter would feel the need to leave. His subsequent communications gave me the impression that he was in a panic. He was unsure of what to say to each person. He didn't tell my grandparents the whole tale, which infuriated them. They were unaware of my dad's remarks to me or Laura's desire for me to go. They simply assumed I had vanished. So things got really nasty when they discovered what really happened. In the end, David and Laura knocked on people's doors to inquire whether anybody had seen me. In some of the texts, they seemed so desperate, almost like they were attempting to play the victims, that it was almost humiliating. Now that they were being questioned by a large number of individuals. However, I was aware. I departed, but they weren't angry. The fact that everyone else was aware of it infuriated them, right now. For me, the guilt trip didn't work. I became more aware that I wasn't only angry as I went through their texts. I had finished. There was no turning back. Laura obviously didn't want me there, and I couldn't stop hearing what my dad had said. It was clear that nothing I did would ever be sufficient, despite my best efforts to improve matters, provide a hand, and maintain harmony. I wasn't going to plead for their acceptance any longer, and they didn't want me there. Even though my aunt could see I was having a rough day, she didn't encourage me to talk about it. All she did was give me the space I sorely needed. She did visit my room later that night and inquire if I would want to spend some time with her. I made no hesitation at all. I did, of course. I couldn't go back to my dad's house, and I didn't want to keep going to other friends' places. It seemed secure to stay with Maggie. It was how I got away from the madness. The remainder of the day was a haze. The most of time was spent on my phone, where I read every remark left on my dad's post to see how others were responding. Some were attempting to defend him by claiming that the epidemic was making things more difficult for everyone, or that perhaps I was simply a challenging adolescent. However, the majority of people supported me and questioned why a 13-year-old would feel the need to leave in the first place. Even distant family members expressed their disappointment in my dad for allowing things to become this bad. Even though I was grateful for the assistance, I was still in pain. My own dad had picked Laura above me, regardless of how many others pointed the finger at him. He had made it apparent that I wasn't one of his top concerns. I made an effort not to give it much thought, but it stayed with me. And the pain just became worse each time I looked at my phone. I eventually texted my dad back before bed that night. The message wasn't lengthy. I only wanted to let him know that I was safe and would not be returning. I informed him that I wanted to wait until I was ready to speak with him and that I would be spending some time with Maggie. I didn't care to read his response, which came practically immediately. For a day, I had had enough. I was lying in bed, looking up at the ceiling. I came to the realization that things would never be the same again. Not with Laura, not with my father. For the first time in a long time, too. That was okay with me. Things began to feel a little more normal after spending a few days at my Aunt Maggie's house, or as normal as they could be. Following all of the events. My dad was still texting me all the time, but I wasn't really reading them. To be honest, I wasn't prepared to hear what he had to say, and I knew what he wanted to say. He continued sending messages like, "Let's work this out," or "We need to talk." However, he never genuinely expressed regret for his remarks to me that evening. It was all about Laura and how I needed to be more understanding and patient with her. Even after I made it plain that I wasn't returning, it seemed like he was still picking her over me. I eventually made the decision to block Laura and him on my phone. I was sick of feeling like I was the one who had done something wrong and sick of guilt trips. I wasn't going to allow them to continue entangling me in their mess, and I wasn't responsible for making things better. All of this was made possible by my Aunt Maggie. If I didn't want to, she didn't force me to discuss what had transpired. She just made sure I had a place where I could relax and work things out. I felt at ease since she even furnished her guest room with my favorite blankets and munchies, making it feel like my own. Having someone who truly cared about my feelings and had no ulterior motives was pleasant. Maggie eventually asked me, "Do you think you'll ever talk to your dad again?" As we sat at the kitchen table one day, she was not being demanding. She seemed to be providing me an opportunity to express my true feelings. I honestly didn't sure how to respond, so I didn't respond straight away. A part of me hoped that my dad could somehow put things right and heal the situation. The part of me that had heard him utter those awful things, however, didn't believe it was possible. How can you get over that kind of thing? "I'm not sure." At last I responded, "I don't believe I can forgive him, but I want to talk to him, not after his words." Maggie gave a nod. "That's reasonable. Right now, you don't need to make any decisions. Go slowly." I was in need of hearing that. I didn't immediately require a solution. All I wanted was room to think. My grandparents, meantime, were still upset with my dad. I didn't even need to explain what had occurred to them. My dad's social media posts and some discussions with other family members had already helped them piece everything together. To my honest amazement, they had completely ceased communicating with him. Although I expected them to be upset, I wasn't prepared for them to interrupt him in such a manner. I suppose that proved to me that I wasn't the only one who believed he was at fault. My grandmother would contact me every few days to see how I was doing. I liked that she didn't mention my father. She generally inquired about my well-being, the state of affairs at Maggie's, and whether I needed anything. She was, in my opinion, attempting to make up for the fact that things had gone so wrong. It was reassuring to know that at least one family member had my back, even if none of it was her fault. Compared to my dad's place, life at Maggie's was much more laid back. Tension was absent, no need to tread carefully. In fact, I felt as though I could breathe normally again. I studied online during the day. Thank you for assisting Maggie around the home and for the pandemic. It wasn't thrilling, but it was just what I needed after months of feeling like I was always in fight or flight mode. The problem was that despite my aunts and my grandparents' unwavering support, I continued to have a nagging sense of emptiness within. Yes, I was relieved to be away from my dad's place, but my thoughts kept returning to my half-brother. He was new to me. A part of me also feared that I might never get the opportunity if I avoided my dad and Laura. All of this was innocent of him. Furthermore, it didn't seem fair that everything that had transpired between my dad and me would prevent me from becoming his sister. It was difficult, but I tried not to think about it. I always worried if my brother would be included in my future plans. However, I was also aware that I couldn't return to my dad's house even if it was only to see him. Not quite yet. I wasn't certain that I would ever be prepared to confront them. I was looking through my phone one evening when I noticed a notification about my dad's social media accounts. In a lengthy, drawn-out message about family, he expressed remorse for the way things had turned out with me. He didn't say my name, but it was obviously directed at me. He expressed in his writing his desire to heal fences and reunite the family. I became enraged again after reading it. He was behaving as though expressing regret to me online equated to offering an apology in person. As if posting a nebulous guilt trip statement would resolve anything. But it didn't. He would have sent me a letter, contacted my aunt, or done something else besides trying to win over strangers on the internet if he truly cared. I turned off my phone and tossed it on the bed. I refused to allow him to ensnare me in his play again. Not at this moment. I informed Maggie about the post the next morning. "That sounds like your dad," she remarked, shaking her head. "He is unable to simply acknowledge his mistake. Really, that was all. That was the issue. He was unwilling to acknowledge his mistake. All he wanted was for everything to return to normal. As if nothing had ever occurred. But I had changed as a person. To cheer him up, I wasn't going to act like everything was well. I then made the decision to cut him off entirely. I requested Maggie not to share any information about him with me unless it was absolutely necessary, banned his number, and unfollowed him on social media. I needed time to move on with my life, and I couldn't do that while he was continually attempting to pull me back. However, it was more difficult than I had anticipated. It takes more than merely pressing the block button to cut someone off, even if they have harmed you. There were times I wanted to get in touch. There were times when I longed for the past. I would then recall myself of that evening, though, of his statements, and I would recall why I needed to maintain my distance. It seemed good to move on without them, even if it wasn't easy. It seemed like my only remaining choice. Okay, let's fast forward a few years. I had been able to detach myself from my father and keep that aspect of my life apart. Given all that was going on with my own health, it wasn't easy. However, I had finally reached a point where I felt in control of the situation. I had made a life for myself, even though it wasn't flawless. Then suddenly, I received a message from my father. Following years of quiet, all of a sudden he wanted to speak. I initially believed that perhaps, just possibly, he was apologizing. Or perhaps he had woken up and wanted to make things right. However, making apologies was not the goal here. I seemed to be the only one who could help him put his life back together after everything had fallen apart. My stepmother, his wife, had totally flipped on him, it turned out. She began accusing him of being sexist, belligerent, and aggressive. The kicker in all 9 yards? It was all phony. In this instance, he was the target of the same nonsense that she had perpetrated against me years before. Admittedly, I experienced a strange feeling of déjà vu when I first read his note. In my mind, I could practically hear her voice making the same outrageous charges and distorting the facts to make herself appear to be the victim. I had been there. I had experienced her gaslighting me. The moment she performed it to me, however, was different. My father supported her and allowed it to occur. Because of that, he even became violent with me. And it was me who was expelled from the family. He had nowhere to go after being evicted from the residence. To be honest, I found it difficult to sympathize with him. I got the impression that she had made everyone in their social circle hostile to him. No one accepted his version of events, and he was facing some severe legal charges and allegations. He was now desperate after she portrayed him as this monster. The statement that he had attempted to approach his parents and my grandparents and they had rejected him, however, was what truly struck a chord with me. My grandparents. These were the same individuals who had always stood with him through thick and thin. Even they had finished with him by now. It seems that they informed him he wasn't welcome when he arrived at their door asking for assistance. They essentially informed him that he was no longer a member of the family because of the way he treated me. After all that transpired between us, I suppose they had finally had enough. To be honest, even throughout my parents' darkest moments, my grandparents had always been there for me during this chaos. I was thus not overly shocked to learn that they had disowned him. The condition they set for him, however, caught me off guard. They informed him that he needed to make amends with me before he could have any hope of returning to their life. That was their agreement. No making amends with me, no family reconciliation, and he was contacting you for that reason. Not because he was sorry for the way things turned out. He needed me to clean up his mess, not because he knew what he had done was bad. I couldn't help but chuckle when I read that passage. Really, that was really characteristic of him. Nothing had changed about him. It was the correct thing to do, but he didn't want to apologize or make amends. All he wanted to do was do whatever it took to win back my grandparents' favor. He was the main focus, as if it had always been. To be honest, I wasn't even angry. I had just finished. I had had time to recover from the years of quiet and the distance. I understood that I didn't need him in my life. Not totally, of course. He was attempting to worm his way back in since he had no one else left, and I had already gone on without him. I didn't think twice when he asked if we could discuss the situation further. No, I told him bluntly, and that was all. No lengthy justification. Don't attempt to lessen the blow. Just a basic corporation. No. His lifeline was not going to be me, not with all that he had done. And most definitely not because his wife had thrown him out, and he now required me to clean up his mess. He didn't take it well, of course. After that, he bombarded me with texts in an attempt to coerce me into lending him a hand. "I'm still your father," he replied, "and family should support one another during difficult times." As though that had previously meant anything to him. I wasn't buying into his constant insistence that we could resolve our differences. I was aware that he had no interest in mending our relationship. I was the only thing preventing him from re-entering the family, which was all he desired. After that, I didn't reply to any more of his texts. After blocking him, I carried on with my day. It wasn't that difficult at all. To be honest, there was no second-guessing or emotional battle. I had long since come to terms with the circumstance. The fact that he had abruptly found himself on the other side of things did not change the fact that he was no longer a part of my life. In actuality, he made his decisions. When his wife was tearing me apart, he made the decision to support her. Now that he's finally recognizing her true nature, he wants me to intervene and save him after he rejected me and sided with her deceit and manipulation. I'm not going to do that. He is capable of handling the fallout from his decisions, just as I had to. Regarding my grandparents, I accept their choice to reject him. They're holding him responsible since they witnessed what he did to me. To be honest, that's more than I ever anticipated. However, it will never be possible to mend our relationship. Not after everything. That's where we are at the moment. My dad is attempting to get in touch with me to put things right, since it will help him. But his life is in ruins. Furthermore, I have no interest. I will not be his means of re-entering the family, nor will I allow him to re-enter my life only because he has exhausted all other possibilities. So yes, I told him no, and I have no regrets about it.